topic, share impact, create engaging communications and reports for your volunteer program. What we'll cover today: why communicating impact to your volunteers is vital for your program, the benefits and challenges of sharing impact with your volunteer base, and plus we'll talk about some practical tips and resources for sharing impact. So stay to the end for those tips, because we're also going to, along the way, discuss what the positive outcomes for sharing impact are and how volunteer managers can develop a successful data strategy, which is a big part about this, and what tools and practices support sharing your impact. So let's just start off right away and talk about what is sharing program impact. That way we all can start on the same page. As Elizabeth and Mike and I were chatting and working on this, really realized that sharing impact is, more of a visioning activity for volunteer programs. It's something that includes many steps along the way throughout the program, which can be what actually makes it a little bit challenging, but it can also be what makes it really meaningful. So got a little definition here put together, and you can also feel free to add to that in the chat box. But sharing program impact involves determining which elements best reflect the impact of your program based on your program's mission. So that could be volunteer hours, students served, meals delivered, etc. Then ensuring that you develop a system for capturing important data and keeping accurate records of these elements. This data and information is then communicated via channels and methods to spread the word about your program impact to your volunteers, supporters, and the community. So anything to add there, Elizabeth? I think we talked about this the other day.
Yeah, no, I think what's really interesting is, like you said, it is a vision exercise, because if you overcomplicate any part of it, you get bogged down. So you have to really be thinking about, what can I do? What can I track all year long? And I think as we talk into some of this, what is the purpose of what I'm tracking? There's the big why behind the data point. What am I doing with this? Where is it going to go? What story is it going to tell? What grant is it going to be applied to? So that moment of almost starting with the end in mind and then working backwards, it isn't intuitive. I think that's one of the things that always catches me is I'm building as I go quite often, and I get to the end and wish I had built something way back here. So it is kind of pre-planning where you want to land. That I kind of have really, as we built this, presentation, I've been thinking, like, that's so empowering to know, like, this is where I'm going. And once you have everyone across department and across your organization buying into this is where we're going, then you have that ability to say, okay, now this is what I'm going to ask you to help with along the way, so we can get to where we all said we wanted to go.
That's a great point, Elizabeth, because I think with something like this, it can be very easy to be in the mindset of, we're going to just tell everyone what we did. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, where I have been many times, is looking backwards and saying, okay, what is it that, like, did we do what we said we were going to do, and how can we communicate that? I've been in that position many times. Perhaps I'm not alone in that, but I do feel like, that visioning activity of thinking about this as more of a forward momentum sort of way of thinking, is where are we going? And that really does help you in discerning how to, collect the data and build like those types of systems, so that you've got that vision in mind for the end of what it's going to be like when you share this with your volunteer base. And it might be something you do at intervals. You could do it in a small way at the end of an event. You could do it once a month, quarterly, or twice a year, or once a year. So there's really different ways that you can design the cadence of it. But having sort of that check-in of making sure, like, as you're moving throughout the year, as Elizabeth was saying, that you really are, making certain to get those important pieces in play. So this is, I just had a blast. I was spending some time on the Points of Light website, and really loved, there was some really great information on there about, how to discern what your program impact really is. And I absolutely loved it. So there was a joint presentation by Common Impact and True Impact, and they did just an introduction into insights and impact. And they had this definition in their presentation that volunteerism is a philanthropic contribution of labor to help a charitable initiative achieve its social mission. And a lot of what they were focusing on, and I felt like this was just a really important way of thinking about this, was through this lens of activities, outputs, and outcomes. And this really, I just felt like this was a really great way of sort of breaking down these needs, that activities are the things that we do in our programs, right? So we show up, and for me as a volunteer, like, I go and clean out the horse stalls at the nonprofit that I volunteer at. And then the outputs of that are, what comes out of that, right? So, okay, these chores got done, these hours got logged. That's the program output. Like, this volunteer did these activities. But then the outcomes, that's where the sweet stuff really seems to lie, and it seems to be the most challenging to measure. And so, the outcomes are really how the line is drawn from the activities to the outputs to really the impact. And so that might be like, we had all these volunteers complete all these hours, and that meant that we could sponsor 25% of students with a scholarship. So that means this many kids in our community got a scholarship. So I felt like this was an exciting thing to start talking about. And I know that it's not always easy to draw that line, but I think it's a good way to think through this, sharing impact. So because I know many of us are trying to just collect hours, right? Like, let us know in the chat if you're feeling challenged with just getting that done. Because I know I hear from a lot of volunteer managers. Elizabeth, you probably do too.
Yeah, I was just looking at, I'll pick on Morgan, but Morgan put in that he's a city, or she is a citywide volunteer hub. And that one's really interesting because it is, when we were talking about this the other day, Mike and I were saying, hours is that common denominator. We can all talk in hours. So it's the one you have to kind of fall back on. But as far as, you can make it as exciting as you can. We're going to do more hours this year than last year, but it doesn't feel like what you just talked about, Court, where it's a tangible outcome. There's an impact you see in a student scholarship. So I think that's the interesting part, is when, I think his illustration, forgive me if he, she, but with the various data points, we've got books shelved, bags of trash collected, dogs walked, meals served. Those are so disparate. Like, there's nothing that pulls those together. But there is a citywide volunteer program. So while I'm just off the cuff and it will not be this easy, Morgan, like, there's those moments where it's like, what are we trying to achieve in our city? Is it to come together as a community to say, this many people joined together to improve our city this year? And here are some of the ways we improved it. We improved these neighborhoods, these learning opportunities for students with new books. And so you're kind of making this community goal. And that's the hard part. It's going to be different for everyone here today, but it's like, what is that outcome that when you talk about it, I'm not there so I can do more hours. I'm there because I need to, and I want to see an outcome happen. So I think that's the, if you can get it, that's the critical part to, talk to your volunteers about and see what it is that they want to hear from you about the success. What was success in their mind? And how will you know when you've hit some of those markers that they view as success? Was it, a certain amount of when they drive to work, they don't see trash on the sides of the street because that trash program has changed what those sidewalks look like? Is it something where, you can track reading and, every single child in our community got a book for Christmas because of this book drive we did? Things like that are such a tangible goal. It's what will make them feel good about the program. And it might not be a lot. I think, Court, you talk about it. Sometimes your volunteers are the audience that doesn't demand updates as much as your board would or your annual giving campaign, but they're often the ones that need that encouragement and learning what it is that encourages them and what it is they're watching is only something you can do by asking your volunteers. It's that one-on-one conversation to really get to know what they love, what they want to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that really differentiating, that, what the board might need to hear about is different for than for volunteers, what they need to hear about, because your volunteers, you want them to show up in an engaged manner. And you want them to be excited and enthusiastic about showing up for your program. So sharing impact with them as a specific audience is going to look very different than, sharing it to a different sort of reporting entity. I think it's maybe a little bit of this, it may be a little bit of an art form, right? You're taking like sort of data, but you're making certain to reach this specific audience with what's important to them. And it may be something that is very different than the data that has to be reported to the board or the director or those people that, and like Elizabeth said, like the volunteers aren't necessarily saying to us like, could we please see our impact report for the year? Like they might not ask for something like that, but if you can, share with them meaningful change that they've contributed to, that is where, really like, that's where you can really work towards seeing how sharing impact with them is also a form of volunteer appreciation. It's also a form of volunteer retention and volunteer engagement. And so it's just a different mindset because they're not asking for necessarily, they might, I don't know your volunteers, they might really love numbers and data, but they might also just really want to hear, because a lot of times when I sign up to volunteer, it's because I really tend to care about the cause or the mission of the organization. And so learning what motivates your volunteers and why they're here is going to help you know exactly what to share with them about the changes that they've contributed to over the course of their time with you and your organization. Any other thoughts on that before we move forward?
There's a few questions. There's one question in the chat from Veronica of what if you've not developed programs as yet in order to tell your story, but need volunteers and funds to move forward?
Yeah.
So a little bit of a chicken and egg situation.
Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on that? Because
you made me take it. All right.
Well, I have some ideas. But I want to hear from you too.
Yeah, no, I think it's a little bit of the art form of marketing, is you're telling the story of what's gonna come and what will be versus reporting on what you just did or what was, or looking in that rearview mirror. So, there are some, and I'll drop this, actually I'll look up, make sure I get it right. But there's sites like Pexels, I think it's Pexels. But there's sites like that have just generic imagery that you can grab so that it almost feels like you had the event. It lets you bring to life what they're going to be doing by just using some of these free stock photos. And then you're kind of just talking about it like you've done this before. I mean, some of it is, you might play, this is brand new, come experience this for the first time. And you also might play to a different audience the next time of just, let's show you what we're going to be doing together. And this is our goal. And this is what we're going to try to accomplish. And this is our first one. So there's that moment of like reporting, even if the first one didn't have any attendance, it's reporting, we've done our first one, we're on to stage 2, excited to have you share with your friends so we can have even more people come this time. It's almost Imagine If, where you're just putting the markers in place. I mean, when Court and I even started the webinar series, we did not have as many people attending as we do today. But it was just that moment of like, we're going to keep doing this thing and we're going to listen to what you all are asking questions around and what topics are most intriguing and what people want to learn. And we're just going to keep doing it. So it built naturally over time because we were putting the work into, the activity was good, the content was good, the pictures were good, building it like there's more to it, and then just coming forward with it to tell what you did, even if it was small. People see progress, they want to be part of something that's building. So I think it's just as good and exciting as others.
I would also say on that topic, when trying to put together a picture of are building a case for how to receive funding. This, in the spirit of webinars or meetings like this, is collaborating with organizations that might already be doing the type of work that you want to be doing. Generally, you're going to find a lot of helpful folks out there who believe in the mission of their work and would be willing to help and share some of their information. And so calling around and asking around for folks that share your vision and your passion to help get some of that information together to make a case.
Yeah, especially like the way that I think about a little bit of what Mike was just saying and a little bit of what Elizabeth was saying too is I would sit and ask myself, how can I start meaningful conversations in my community surrounding my cause? And that sort of opens up a lot of different possibilities. Like it can look a lot of different ways, right? So you know what it is that you want to make an impact on, and you're building a program. So how can I connect with people and start these meaningful conversations? Because when you sort of fold that engagement in, I believe, to the building process, and this is perhaps I'm touching on a little bit what Mike was saying, but folding that engagement in, it actually can be really energizing to people to want to join in on that momentum and support building that momentum. So you're sharing the vision for the impact you'd like to make on your cause, and you're sharing why it's important. And any chance you could get to have meaningful conversations about that, I think is a chance to get started. I volunteer with an organization that started off with one volunteer for a long time. And then I started helping that volunteer, and then there was another person, and now we have, some more regular volunteers, and we still have a long way to go. But there's other things that are indirect impact that our activities are having. Like our activities are very indirect towards the program, but they're very important for making the program go forward. So that's something that I would think about. I don't know. What do you think about that idea of just finding ways of connecting with people over the cause, and what your vision is for impacting the cause? Any feedback on that in the chat?
And I think while you guys are looking at that, I was just listening to you, Cord. I was thinking it almost, when you're starting small, it is very much one-to-one. It's that first person. And then when Cord attended, it was probably her being asked to look around for friends in her social network that also cared about this cause. So those conversations are finding people who care about the cause and inviting them one-on-one. So the next meeting has everyone bring someone with them, and the next meeting has everyone who attended that meeting bring someone with them, because there's this jump that you can make into one-to-many invitations, but there's nothing like that personal invitation when you're getting going, to just make sure that you have, like-minded cause-based individual group coming together.
Yeah. And I definitely got involved with it because I really cared about the cause, and I really cared about local students having access to this opportunity. I was like, this is really important for local students to have access to this opportunity, and I really believe in this. So that's sort of why I felt the need to be involved. So let's talk about some of the benefits of sharing impact with your volunteers. And we've already touched on it a little bit, but volunteers feel appreciated when you've made it clear to them that they've made a difference. Especially those folks that, show up week in and week out. They really do appreciate being appreciated. It boosts morale, sometimes amongst volunteers and employees, because it makes everything a little bit easier when folks know that what they're doing is really making a difference. Volunteers who know their impact, and this is what Elizabeth was just touching on, but volunteers who know their impact and are clear on it are much more likely to spread the word about your cause and your organization. So it's a real potential for increasing recruitment, because instead of saying, oh, I volunteered this many hours, they can say, I do this every weekend, and this is why, this is what happens. This is the why behind it. I think it's also a really great chance, and this is something that we've talked about quite a bit, but getting support for those reporting efforts, like the willingness to log hours. that seems to be a challenge in this field. Let me know in the chat if that's true for you or if you've seen it, run into it before. But my feelings on this are that when you can draw the line for volunteers, like, hey, we need you to log these hours because it supports our funding efforts, it supports these other things, which helps the impact, right? Which long-term helps the impact. So sometimes they may not really be feeling the connection between the activity of logging hours and the impact the program is making. And so I think storytelling and being able to share more about that really can help garner some of that buy-in support on the reporting, like, please help us do this. It's very important because they might not care about how many hours they're giving. Again, it's just that knowing your audience and who you're talking to, that might not be the most important thing they're doing. They would do the amount of hours no matter how many it was. They care about something else. But we need their support in the reporting aspect. Let me know, how's that hitting, landing for folks?
That is, I will say, one of the major challenges, Court, that we always hear is that rarely is the why for a volunteer to report hours. Maybe if it's a student and it's for a scholarship program, but most of the time, not what they care about. So I think you're right on track that it has to be tied to something they do care about, because if they care about the cause, they want your organization to have more funding. If they care about the cause, they want to see that the goal was hit to get enough, one-on-one volunteer hours with students or with families to support them. So those goals being, we want to reach 10 more students. That means we need to do 500 more hours this year. And we want to track those hours, because if we can do this, there's an education grant that our organization is going to try to win. You're tying those dots so that now when I log in and I don't see any hours in my, volunteer profile in our software or wherever you're keeping track, then it's like, oh, my hours aren't here. We need to get my hours in here. If I don't care about the hours, that zero doesn't matter to me unless you've made that zero matter to me, because I now know, hey, that goal on the wall, my hours aren't in there. And I want to be part of this because I want to achieve this goal. It's just taking it down to that personal element for sure.
Yeah, I feel like that really kind of goes into this next one of inviting further engagement by sharing stats towards reaching a larger goal. So to get that buy-in, and I think that's a great idea. There's a reason why charts work really well. As we love that visual to be able to see that, like, my little contribution is a part of this larger whole. And so it is that chance of kind of like, if you can vision, like, even, for a 90 days, this is what we're going to try and do over the next 90 days. And then have everyone's, kind of energy, because it's really hard to have that amount of momentum by yourself as a volunteer leader, or whatever your role is at your organization. It can be really challenging. And so just giving your volunteer base, or your new and growing volunteer base, a chance to help you build that momentum, so that you're not doing so much heavy lifting on your own, but really setting it up so that it's easier for folks to kind of meet you there. And I do feel like it also supports your retention efforts, especially throughout your volunteer communications. If you're regularly sharing, impact, like maybe an impact update section in your newsletter could be really fun. Like if you have a monthly volunteer newsletter, and you can share those sort of like little pieces towards your big goal, that can keep folks really engaged, especially as, we can get tired. We could go through seasons in our lives. Somebody could maybe take a break for a month because they have something going on in their family, and then they come back again. But making sure that you're communicating that impact at regular intervals makes it feel like, okay, I want to come back here. Like, we're still on track. And then volunteers just feel clear about the impact your organization's making. Elizabeth, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, it's not rocket science, but it's a habit. And I think that habit, I'm seeing a couple people, get connected. There's some other systems out there that you can track, when they clock in, when they clock out. whether it's your volunteers are recurring enough that you need to almost train them like an employee. So they walk in the door, they check in at the Get Connected check-in kiosk. That's their first step every time they come. Then they go here, then they do that. Or their first step is use the Cause Connect app. You go in, you check out. Like you do your rhythm of that's how they're trained. If you don't have consistent volunteers, they're just newbies every single time. Then I think, Court, you alluded to it. You got to train your staff at your organization that no one starts without step one. And it is habits. And it's, I think Mike and I've got kids, there's that moment of like, the animals are the same. You've got to train a habit and you can break a bad habit, but it takes like 5 nights of misery. But once you've done it, like you get past that breaking, that retraining of a bad habit. Now it's a new habit. And I think that's just top down. You've got to do it yourself. You've got to make it that habit, put a giant poster board up on the wall. No one steps forward without X first. I think it's silly but it's just people herding cats. Like we do as we're told if we're trained to do it, and they'll forget every once in a while. But just like every employee that learns to have to clock in, clock out, like they may have to go back to clock in every once in a while when they forget, but they know that's their step. That's what matters. So yeah, it's a little bit of just setting up those patterns for people.
Yeah, I definitely think of it as like a pattern for sure, because, I might come in at different times. I might be doing different routines, but sort of the pattern is the same. And I love a good poster board. Like, you cannot, you cannot do that enough for me. So I like a nice poster board that's like 1, 2, 3, like, log in, log your hours, start off here. Are you wearing your name tag? Like certain things like that, because I've done, volunteer programs where you always have to wear a name tag because you're working with so many people and they wouldn't know who's there to help them if you don't have a name tag on. And so, it's this, I would just kind of say it's the same thing as putting your name tag on, or it's the same as making sure you wear closed-toed shoes because you have to when you're doing warehouse packing. Like those are just the guidelines. And some of those things I think are really great to sort of include in your volunteer onboarding, your volunteer training, when you do your orientation, whatever it is that you call it at your organization. But the more you grow, the more necessary that sort of formalization of the process becomes. And you'll start to feel it when you realize it's too much to do yourself. You'll realize that you need a system to support you, because it's just too much to handle without having a training and an onboarding and all of those things. And when you go over them, it's just setting clear expectations. But what we know is that like down the line, that's just going to help you so much more, and making sure you can reach your goals of making an impact and then being able to share it so that you can keep moving forward.
I'm seeing a lot, in the chat where you are tying it to fundraising. I think, I've seen the thermometer as a visual, but you also might just try to find a funder. That matching program doesn't have to just be on the donation side. You might have a funder who's going to give $1 per hour this month. So let's try to get our hours logged. So it's just like this push where your funders actually, the whole motivation is we need to be able to track these hours. And that funder understands that you'll win more grants if you're able to start people in the habit of doing this. So it just lets you put that cherry on top to like make it a very intentional push to get people in the habit that might be short-lived, but once the habit's formed, then it continues. So that's some of the things I've also heard others try, where if they can get a supporter behind it, people see dollars, they want to earn those dollars. It's just a natural human tendency, especially if it goes to the cause they care about.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of baked into programs like Dollars for Doers that corporate social responsibility programs have, where they're paying for employees to take time off of work to volunteer, and then they're giving grants to the organizations based on those volunteer hours. So there's some cool ways of really sort of baking it all in together. I'm thinking about baked goods far too much, but the overall benefits do just involve potential increased funding opportunities, because you can start to really show a clear picture of the impact that you're making. And then also just improve program outcomes. That's what we really care about, is all of those good things that you're trying to do are going well and you're really working towards that happening, because that's what we care about, seeing that happen. So why is this hard? Why is this hard to do? We've touched on it a little bit. These are some of the common challenges, and I think these are really important to honor the fact that this is a challenging job. Managing volunteers. When you manage volunteers, you wear the hat of so many different sort of functionalities in your role. Not only are you managing people that you're not paying, but you're also marketing and recruiting and telling stories and collecting data. It's really a lot. And so I do want to never underestimate, but always to honor the fact that volunteer managers are wearing a lot of hats, and you're very, very busy people, and you're very important. And so we understand that there are a lot of challenges there. So number one is often just, how are we collecting accurate volunteer program data? And we've touched on the hours challenges that perhaps unify many volunteer managers. Budget for your program or staff power, right? Like, how many people are entering this data or processing this data or making sure that it's being collected? Maybe you have this data stored on a spreadsheet, but it's not necessarily streamlined for you to be able to pull a report from easily. So that could be a challenge. Or it could be very decentralized. Maybe it's in a lot of different places and in a lot of different formats, and it's not accessible. And then also just truly discerning, is this the best data point to share impact with my volunteers? So some of those things, again, it's like drawing that line to the story arc of what do my volunteers really care about hearing about? And then really knowing so that's why I'm saying volunteer managers wear so many hats, because it's like, once you figure out what they care about, then you've got this other hurdle of figuring out how to communicate it. And that's this whole other sort of thing. And so these are just very normal, very common challenges. If you've ever felt any of these, I don't believe that you're alone. I think you're in good company. Many of us have been there. So what do we do about it? Elizabeth, do you have anything else to add to this before I move forward?
No, I think I'll go first, then you might pass it over to you.
I was just
So-
gonna put this out to the group in the chat, just because there was a question earlier that Elizabeth spoke to in the chat about engaging a specific segment of volunteers. So in that instance, it was folks who are 55 plus. And but we work with a lot of organizations that might draw really heavily from school systems or from companies, and just put that to the group in the chat, that if you have experiences of shaping your messaging to engage with volunteers from specific areas where you have a lot of success or a lot of challenges, even drawing from particular groups, I'm sure everyone would appreciate each other's insights.
Yes, please do share that.
And it's a present challenge per Jessica. Yeah, and I think that there's another one, Court, that we'll have to, maybe you'll remember, but just, it was a webinar about that, how you speak to different audiences and kind of their language and which communication tool to use for it. So we may come back to that. I think on this slide, the thing I was going to chime in on is, to your point of hats, it may be as you're listening, you're like, all 6 of these are my hats. I will have to coordinate with Elizabeth, who will coordinate with Elizabeth, who will coordinate with Elizabeth. So that moment of knowing you're not biting off more than you can chew, and you're making a plan that you can maintain, because it's better to tell 2 stories well. Maybe it's the one that is the hour story and the one that is the storytelling story, and you're going to couple those 2 together, than to have 6 and you just don't have the momentum to do all of this for all 6. The other thing is, if these aren't all you, if you're like, oh, that's another department, or I've got to get on the communications team's calendar if I want to have a plug in the newsletter in March, and I'm going to have to make sure I know what grants we're trying to win, because they're going to actually be counting hours. And I decided to be real creative and not count hours this year. I was going to do meals served. And I found out that the grant we're trying to win was dependent on us counting more hours this year. I think those are the things to just make sure if this isn't your hat, you do some preliminary vision planning as a team so that you know how to get into those communication calendars to tell your story, but also what data point matters to them. Because there's a beauty with data points where some are very concrete, an hour is an hour is an hour. But we've talked before about how a volunteer at a food bank, 2 hours might translate in rough quantities to a certain amount of pounds of food, or 2 hours driving on a Meals on Wheels program counts for this many meals delivered. So that moment of you can take the one increment your grants need to tie to, but tell a story by interpreting, okay, on average in 2 hours, this is how many meals are delivered, so that you can make it a much more impactful visual, a story. I think we've talked about too, like, how do you tell your story? Like, is it a picture of cutting squares out for a teacher's packet is not fun, and cutting those squares out is not fun. So the story that volunteer really needs to hear and see is the final picture of the kids who are using those flashcards in the classroom, because otherwise they really didn't have a great time cutting squares for 2 hours. So that moment of like, how do you tell your story? How are you going to weave it back to the first volunteers when you get to the end of the story? I think all of that's, don't go too deep. Do what you can maintain and do well, and make sure you've got the right buy-in from others if you need them and they're not all your own hat.
Yeah, definitely find support where you can. I would say too, some of what you were chatting about, Elizabeth, really, goes into also what Mike brought up in the chat, is that knowing who you're talking to when you're sharing these things. So it might even be, if you have a large volunteer base, that you have very diverse age groups, and maybe they care about different things. They care about different aspects of your cause. Some of these programs that have, 100 or thousands of volunteers, right? Like your Gen Z volunteers might be signing up for very specific opportunities. So they want to hear about those outcomes. And then your, retired volunteers might be signing up for other types of opportunities. So at that point, you might have more elaborate system for sharing program impact with each segment of your volunteer. Or perhaps you have a volunteer organization that has many programs. And so you would share, impact and outcomes based on those programs as well. So at that point, you are orchestrating something that's a very specific message to a very specific audience. Gen Z tends to care about a lot of like community activism. So those are the types of opportunities we're like seeing them trend towards signing up for. So the way that they often communicate seems to be on social media and video and things like that. And so they might not care about a really beautiful, formalized, glossy mailer that comes into their home address. They might just want to see a social media account that's like a video of you just sharing what happened. That might mean the most to them. So it's really a little bit more about, understanding who your volunteers are and how they really receive these communications. And, for a lot of these things that we're talking about too, we do have a lot of other resources in our learning center. And so we'll make certain to link all of that in the follow-up recording. Because, we're talking about one very specific aspect of communication. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper on volunteer communications, we've got resources for that too. All right, so we sort of have woven together all of these different aspects of this building a story of sharing impact. And I would say it is, we started at the top of the webinar talking about how this is a multi-step vision. This is a multi-step process. And Elizabeth touched a little bit on, what are the types of data that you have and the methods, how do you collect that data, right? So there's different types of data. There is hours data, and you can do that through hours logs, volunteer management software. There's also, other ways of reflecting program impact. Like you could even do interviews with volunteers or community members who are beneficiaries of your services. And that's actually a way of measuring and sharing impact with others. Elizabeth, do you want to add some stuff here? Because I know we talked about all of these things the other day.
There's a lot. And I think what I liked about this, I was telling Courtney is it's, you're probably gonna have one or two. Like the graph has just a few things that are gonna apply so well. And I think it's what do you naturally do well and what can you recruit where you naturally don't do something well. So, where we're hearing some of the storytelling and the sharing might be a channel where I do not use Twitter myself and I'm not very good at it. So I'm going to have to find somebody in my volunteer pool that I could say, hey, can you help me with this? I do like to look at numbers. Like I'm a numbers person. I like to see the trend line. So that's something that, looking at the data and being like, what story can I tell with this data? That is something I'm good at. So I think those moments of knowing your strengths and weaknesses and propping yourself up by asking someone to help you with the part that you do need to have help with, that's just a natural segment here that comes out of picking and choosing what you need most to accomplish what's most important and knowing you cannot do all of this. Again, it's that what is that outcome that you're focused on? What is that end goal for next year's annual campaign grant you're going to write, report for the board, and how you're going to make sure your volunteers hear more stories about what they're meaning to your organization next year. If you've got those 4 outcomes and overall that's going to mean that there's this bold goal of students graduating or more scholarships given, how do you tie the activities that you can maintain in and picking, which are these things that I can do? We're seeing a lot of, and I think Mike, you brought it up, the groups, 55 plus group is going to be a whole different approach than if you need volunteers that are under the age of 24. So that moment of understanding and talking to them, don't just trust your own knowledge base or what you're most comfortable with. It's asking your best volunteers that you want more of. Where do you go for your social media? Who are your friends? Where could we get a little micro volunteerism was one of our webinars. Where could we get an advocate that's just going to volunteer for us by spreading all of the updates that you put into your newsletter into that Instagram channel, because you've learned that's where a big pool of your volunteers sit. So I think that's all I would say is just take this as an idea starter, dig deep into your own volunteers and what they're asking you for and your own data story that you see as most critical, and then pick and choose wisely. What can I do consistently? What can I maintain?
Yeah, I kind of look at this, actually, this tools and practices chart here for sharing impact. I look at this as like a choose your own adventure sort of book. You start on the left-hand side with types of data, and then you would figure out the method for collecting that, the channel for sharing, and then the method for sharing it. So, you might say, okay, we're going to do volunteer and community testimonials because we've learned that people love to hear from other people. So we're going to make sure that we conduct interviews when we're on site for some of our programs. And then we're going to have an in-person appreciation event. And we're going to share that. We're either going to have those people speak or we're going to do a video share because we've just learned that that's the way that our volunteers experience that level of that feeling like, okay, we really feel like we've made an impact. And so you really can sort of find your way around this here and just say, okay, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this, right? And maybe it is, hours completed, or maybe it's project outcomes like lunches served or students tutored. We tutored 25 students for a year. And we saw their test scores increase, whatever it is that you are working with your students for. And then you share that in a written report or an infographic that goes out in your e-newsletter. So there's really so many options, which almost makes it harder. But if you think about it, I'm just going to pick one thing. And then just really figure out like, who are my volunteers? How do they like to communicate? And what types of data can I actually collect? And then just make it happen from there. And going in with that forward thinking, like Elizabeth was talking about earlier. Are there any thoughts on this? Are any of these things something that you've tried? What's worked for you? What's been challenging? Share with me what's going on in the chat over there.
Of things. I think the conversation about segments is something that a couple folks have chimed in on. I was actually just about to ask Donna to elaborate on. She mentioned educational events having that impact their community are high motivators to get Gen Zers to volunteer. And so if there is a specific example or something you'd want to share, a success story that you've had around an event or a type of event that you've hosted, I think that'd be great for everyone to hear about as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important to note, like an education event, it can really be a recruitment event as well without really meaning to be, because when you're just sharing what it is you're doing, sometimes people, don't even know that the problem has like that there is a cause there. So sometimes just educating people on the cause and what problem you're trying to solve is really eye-opening to them. And you can actually, it's amazing how quickly people can become enthusiastic when they really become educated about your program and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think sometimes looking for those opportunities that others are hosting. So I think we've got a good amount of single cause nonprofits here, but looking for a volunteer center, a city center in your area. Sometimes even the local colleges will host, just like they do job fairs, they'll host nonprofit fairs where you have that chance to go into a virtual event I've seen recently in the last couple of years, or an in-person event where you do the same thing Court just said. It's just to a larger audience where they're seeing, what these nonprofits are working on in their communities. And if there isn't something like that happening, I think just raising a hand to ask for it, it's contacting those community leaders to say, hey, we would like to see something that puts more of an emphasis on this, or lets those of us who need more attention get some exposure through a media partner or a central entity like that. Can be a really great approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep moving forward so that we can take maybe the last 10 minutes here for Q&A. This was just a little graphic that we made to kind of share some ways that it could look if you have a volunteer website, how you could share some outcomes. Like for those who use our system, Get Connected, they've got a really beautiful sort of front-facing website that they can spotlight some of their program outcomes. Or maybe you use videos on social media. Those are things that can just really communicate very quickly, that strong visual.
I
And
was going to
then
go back to that one,
Yeah.
Court. But Mike, this is your story. I thought it was really cool when we were talking about setting things up. You were talking about the backpack that you saw. So I thought that was just a nice way to
Oh.
share that story of how one piece actually translated all the way through.
Yeah, and I was just going to mention another comment that came up in the chat from Janessa also about sharing, having a volunteer share the impact of their program, more of a testimonial approach rather than just numbers. And the story for me that was that we were talking about the other day was there's a United Way right across the street from where I work, and I went over to volunteer there, and it was one of my earlier volunteering opportunities, and we were putting together backpacks for students, and it's a room full of school supplies and backpacks, and it was a fun day, but it was hard to really feel the impact of what it meant. I mean, obviously seeing tables full of backpacks felt like something was going to happen, but it didn't really hit home until I went to go pick up my own kid from school one day and saw one of those backpacks like sitting at the door to a classroom, like waiting for someone to come get it. That really helped to close the loop for me personally, and finding folks within your organizations that can tell those kind of stories, or share the feelings that they got when they got to experience that kind of impact, I think can go a long way.
Yeah, my headspace is always, you can't control and hope that what happened to Mike happens. Like, those are the beautiful moments. But I think like how you can control that is, you knew Mike volunteered at the first event. So that moment of making sure that all volunteers that participated in the backpack program see that, photo of the bags hanging at recess ready for pickup or whatever it is, that piece of showing them in play is a photo, it's a story, and it's not as powerful as what Mike experienced in person, but it gets close. It lets you tie the story. So I think that's, again, coming back to this that you were showing us, Court, where you're kind of picking how you're going to weave the story through so that it makes it full circle. And it's not just Mike feeling like he did something good. It's that you actually see, oh, wow, it made it to the end. It made it to the cause. It made it to the thing I really cared about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I really love hearing stories like that, and to hear volunteers share stories like that at volunteer events, or through a video that gets sent out to all the volunteers. That those are the types of things that I feel like, for me personally, because I think numbers are cool, but they're not my favorite thing. I'm like, yeah, the numbers are great, like good, but I want to hear the story. That's more my nature. I really love storytelling. I really love videos. I really love pictures. And so for me, it does put it in perspective. And sometimes you need to see those things next to each other, right? So sometimes you need to see, we did this, and here's one moment, but that happened 1,000 times. So it sort of paints the full picture, that if you have, here's this big number, and maybe that really means something to some people, and maybe it doesn't to others. But if you can also couple it with a story like what Mike just shared, it helps to realize, like, hey, that we did 1,000 backpacks, and so that one moment I had happened 1,000 times across my city, my community. And those are the types of pieces of information I think volunteers really love to hear. That's what I feel like, but I'd be curious if you feel the same as well. And then it might be that when you share that story with, your director, your board, your funders, that, you know, it could work the same way, where it's like, here's this story, here's the number. Like, maybe you just switch the order or the emphasis, because they support each other. Those two things support each other. So it is important to collect that data, and to do that due diligence there, but not to forget about collecting the stories too, and really making sure that you're storing them in a centralized place as well as your data. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure I let you know that we are going to email out the recording on Monday. We're going to send you a bonus sharing impact planning guide that's going to take you through some of these 3 quick action sort of things to take away of determining the most accurate and impactful stats for your program, evaluating your current system and process for collecting impact data. So we've got some fun questions in that planning guide for that, which hopefully you've gained a lot on that today already. And then also the ways of sharing with your volunteer base through meaningful communication channels. So we've got tons of bonus resources that I'll send you on Monday, and that you can also find in our learning center at galaxydigital.com any hour of the day that you like, any day of the week. And Mike's going to drop in the chat our contact info here, just in case you'd like to get in touch with us and learn more about what it is that we do. But are there 1 or 2 questions we could take here in the last 5 minutes, Mike? Or any kind of interesting discussion points that you'd like to share to the larger group that folks have brought up in the chat?
Service learning mentioned as a component. And again, I think that has to do with segment engagement and how you bring volunteers in. And those are very heavily relationship driven arrangements normally. So as a volunteer program leader, it can sometimes be as simple as calling up to see if there's students available to come out for an organization, but it often involves really getting to know who the stakeholders are within an educational organization, to understand what their interests are and see where your messaging and your specific volunteer opportunities can overlap with the things they're trying to achieve.
Seeing the youth serving organizations piece, and tying to youth, you do have those extra privacy concerns once you do have a youth volunteering. But I know some of the resources Mike shared, one of them I was reading, it's getting creative. It's showing the kids' hands but not their faces, or it's showing the backpacks on the fence instead of the backpack on a child. I think that's the piece to think about, is just how do you get creative to tell the story, because the story's still there. You do need to bear in mind permissions and getting a permission or things like that. But I think like the story is still so strong. And the other thing I was just thinking, because this slide had our contact information on it, because we do have volunteer management, is that moment of every picture you share, every story you share, you want to have one. And I think we talked about this in our last webinar, where our presenter was saying, she puts that link, that one stop where you start on everything she does. So if it's just a story, it's still got her website link that takes you straight into her volunteer software so that she can capture through Get Connected who you were. If it's a photo, it's got that hashtag, like that moment of just, you're always sending them to this one stop. So you don't have to have a strong call to action every time, but you always have that one place where they can go for more. So if you do hook them in that second, that volunteer, that person is moving forward into learning more. Because I think Court always tells us over and over again, by the time you're sick of your message, maybe somebody's seen it once or twice. So you've just got to keep at it, and you never know which message is going to be the one that triggers them to think, I should do something. So keeping that action step of just a simple link every single time that drives them to where they can take action, don't leave that element out, because that's so critical in all of the storytelling and stat sharing and encouragement of, here's a story of a great volunteer. If you want to become a volunteer, click here, like that moment of you're always catching, you're always fishing.
Yeah, I usually, my motto is typically, if you are concerned that you've shared too much, you probably haven't shared enough, because it does.
You're more cautious. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're more cautious, then you probably haven't quite shared enough. We just have to consider that people get a lot of emails every day. They're very inundated with communications of all kinds. And so it takes more exposures to a message to be able to really receive that message and really get it. So that's why I really sort of focus on consistency over, one big push and then doing nothing. Like, it's probably better to share at intervals these impact messages with your volunteers, or with those who follow you on social media or who are on your email list, however you're sharing that. And one of the biggest reasons I think that people come to use Get Connected is because they are trying to make it easier for volunteers to sign up and capture their hours. And it makes it a lot easier to do that. And so then the worry about the hours doesn't become so great, and you can go on to telling other stories as well. Well, thank you all so much. We are here right at the top of the hour. And I want to thank you for your presence and being here with us today.
And of course, you usually say it, but it's so true that we know how many hats you wear and how busy you all are. So we do appreciate so much that you come and learn together and share together and inspire each other. And I hope you enjoyed what you heard and learned something today. It sounds like some of you did, and we'll get these resources over to you. But have a wonderful holiday and Merry Christmas, everybody. If you don't see you soon, all sorts of things happening in the new year that, of course, you're excited to get going. So.
We have fresh webinars coming for you in 2023, and we can't wait to connect with you more. And if you need to get in touch with us before then, you can always reach out to us at info@galaxydigital.com. And thank you for your time and your presence.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day.